It's October 1977. On the eve of their second out album being released, it's formally announced to the press that Steve Hackett has left the band. Hackett's decision didn't really come across as a shock to the band, as he's been voicing discontent about the lack of material he was allowed to have on their albums for a long time. As opposed to the fear and panic of when Gabriel's departure came, this time the remaining three seem quite undeterred, with the general feeling that Hackett's absence may provide them with clearer and quicker decision making. The title Seconds Out, as with And Then There Were Three, almost seems to mock the fact that another member had left the band. Now, bearing in mind that Steve was present for most of the Seconds Out mixing, it does beg the question, what would the title of this live album been had he stayed? Steve's departure was not announced to the press for some 4 months after he'd formally quit, by which time the remaining trio had both written and recorded the whole of the And Then There Were Three album. Perhaps this is why in interviews they exerted so much confidence and lack of concern, knowing that their new album was already in the can. After recording the new album, Banks, Collins and Rutherford took time off over spring '78 to plan and rehearse their ever complicated live shows that would promote the soon-to-be released album. Several names have been mentioned for Hackett's onstage replacement. They include Steely Dan session player Elliot Randall, Pat Thrall, Rob McKenzie and Weather Report's Alphonso Johnson. Jeff Beck and Gary Moore have also rumoured to have been considerations, before it was decided upon, on Johnson's recommendation, that Daryl Stuermer, a jazz rock player known to Chester Thompson, would be given the job. Stuermer convinced the band in an audition in which he played along to both Down and Out, Follow You, Follow Me and Squonk. He clinched the job because he knew that the guitar parts would need to be sincerely recreated as opposed to being reinterpreted in perhaps more flamboyant styles. This, after all, is Genesis. The 6-month length of time between recording And Then There Were Three and its final release is puzzling, especially considering that the general kind of uninspired and narrow musical range that many of the final tracks sit in. I can't quite understand why the initial recordings weren't revisited and fleshed out more, or maybe some of the song selections or sequencing altered. Also, considering that Stuermer would have rehearsed the guitar lines for much of the new album prior to its release, why wasn't he invited to overdub his guitar onto the recordings? In a 1978 interview, Collins hinted that Daryl would be invited to play the studio parts on their next album, what was to become Duke, so why not this one? Perhaps this was all the start of the new minimalist Genesis, one that didn't want to constantly layer and build up tracks as they had done in the past, a new and emboldened band, full of confidence and spontaneity perhaps. Either way, let's take a deep breath of the cold and frosty air and venture off into the new era of Genesis and discover more about the tracks that make up And Then There Were Three. Our album opens with the ominous and wintry tones of Banks' Roland string synth, and beneath it we can hear the faint whisper of sleigh bells. The long chords invite us in to wonder what the new post-Hackett Genesis would sound like. Rutherford's guitar riff, which was the hook that the band wrote the song around, bursts in, and soon after Collins lays down some mean and confident drum patterns as if his life and career depended on it, which in some ways they did, but if this album would have failed, it certainly would have been the end of this band.
Smoke a cigar, take the best. Well, don't hedge your bets, we can make a deal. You got it in your pocket, now how do you feel?
So in the same way that Dancing Volcano heralded the dawn of a new era and that the band had better start doing it right, this track references the ever-changing dynamics of the music industry. The Collins lyrics give the track this working title of Man with the Big Cigar, and it perhaps makes a sly reference to Hackett's departure and people who would take his place, and also the creeping advance of punk for men who aren't getting any younger. Collins' lyrics contrast the fat cat record companies in the verses with the anxious musicians in the chorus. However, his oddly metered drumming that almost trips over itself on every fifth beat resulted in the track being difficult to reproduce live, and despite being played a few times, it was quickly dropped from their live set. It's a triumphant, albeit quite deceptive, introduction to the post-Hackett era. Around the time of recording And Then They Were Free, Mike and Tony were approached to write a film soundtrack to a psychological horror film called The Shout. Now, being short of material, Tony decided to take the moody introduction from this song and use it in that film soundtrack. Under a slightly different arrangement, it ends up only being used occasionally in the film, and sadly there's little other music from the two used in the final movie. As a result of its underexposure, Tony ended up reusing the Undertow introduction on his first solo record, A Curious Feeling, a year later, in a track called From the Undertow. So here, Mike adds a faint fretless bass, with Phil's drumming helping the track rise to a crescendo during the chorus. In many ways, that's reminiscent of the song Afterglow. However, the track is swamped by Banks' layers of synth from his newly purchased Yamaha electric piano, and may have benefited perhaps from a more simple arrangement. The lyrics showcase Banks' fondness for all things seasonal, especially the winter, something that dominates much of this album. Our northeasterly winds do indeed blow hard and cold, and the onset of winter is used as a metaphor here for the end of someone's days. This moving song is one of hope, and it reminds us to hold on to the things that we cherish and love as if it was the last days of our life. This is the second group song on the album, with Phil again adding the lyrics. It opens with an expansive and slightly surreal opening that would be reworked on the Duke's Travel song, and it works well in evoking images of the Great American Plains. The rhythms charge in like a stampede of horses that quicken their gallop as the song progresses. Collins is a huge fan and collector of old artifacts from the American 1800s, and in particular the Battle of the Alamo, which he is a noted expert in. And here he tells a loose story of a sheriff named Jim Cooley, who takes on a bet to drive cattle across the Great Plains, where he meets his fate at the hand of a group of Indians.
Hooping and hollering, flashing their knives, thinking his name was jump on a star Indian tribe. He was scared.
Coming off the back of the weighty Undertow, this song sounds a little juvenile and slightly jarring, and may have been better just being left as simply as a B-side to Follow You, Follow Me.
Lay your body down upon the midnight snow. Feel the cold of winter in your hair.
This fantastic Rutherford number was originally arranged in a much faster style and rearranged by Collins into the elegant and thoughtful ballad that we know it as. The cryptic lyrics are open to many different interpretations, but the only real evidence that we have is from a somewhat throwaway quip by Mike that suggested that they're about a man who hides away from the outside world inside a snowman's outfit, and eventually he becomes trapped inside it. The snowman is then found by children who, without a knowledge of the person being trapped inside, further encase him in more rolled snow, and the more they laugh and play, the further trapped inside he becomes. The music echoes this notion and manages to cleverly combine the childhood joy and excitement of waking up to see the snow on the ground, whilst capturing a person's life disappearing before their wild eyes. The soaring chorus is reminiscent of Mike's Ripples, which also deals with the passage of time and one era giving way to another. Perhaps subconsciously the band knew that a change was in the air for them, the wintry chill that blows through much of this record.
They say a snow is a good year filled with the love of all who lie so deep. There goes the snowman. There what a snowman. Hey.
The longest number on the album, Burning Rope, ends up sounding like Tony Banks by numbers. Not that that's a bad thing, but it kind of feels that we just heard too many of these styles of tracks before. Collins himself has cited that this song is typical of the ones he disliked in the band's back catalogue, and playing these types of tracks is what resulted in him leaving the band in the early 90s.
Of those who do not wish you well, you must blaze a trail of your own.
The lyrics that once again centre around autumnal reflection, reminiscence and regrets feel like leftover verses from The Trick of the Tail or Wind and Withering, and it's almost at any moment the song threatens to burst into a One for the Vine like percussion section.
The warming sun, the cooling rain, the snowflake drifting on the breath of the breeze.
The song is broken up slightly by a laboured guitar solo that was written by Banks for Rutherford to play, kind of note for note, and it feels like it. It's really at this moment that we feel the absence of Steve Hackett the most. This is another song set in the American 1800s, when the phrase "Go west, young man" was used to inspire the European settlers to advance and seek their fortunes. The song has a wonderful atmospheric middle section that conjures up images of the American pioneers setting off across the Great Plains. With their wagons rolling the days on into the night, they realised that if they knew then what they know now, they'd probably just stayed at home in the first place.
All along the wagons, all along the dusty trail, 17 years, not over a day, like children in the wild. Your mother's milk still wet on your face, and no one to pray for your safe journey home.
Perhaps the motherlode that they appear in is not so much the gold that awaits them, but more the depths of hardship that they now find themselves in. In keeping with their custom at this time of opening their live shows with a song from the previous album, it was this track that opened the future Duke tour. This bittersweet Tony Banks number is something of a lost classic in the Genesis catalogue. It sees him writing in an uncharacteristically simple style with clear, direct and unambiguous lyrics. In some ways the foundation blocks for the soul-searching tone of Duke are being mapped out here, and it wouldn't surprise me if the inspiration for this song was from Tony observing his bandmate Phil's marriage collapsing around this time. The song centres around someone who feels cheated, stupid, used and abused, and Phil's powerful and impassioned vocal implies that he really feels these lyrics to their core.
I thought I was lucky. I thought that I'd got it made. How can I be so blind?
Mike's guitar here is quite prominent on the track, and it's drenched in the same frosty fuzz that most of this album is coated in. However, here I feel that the guitar really works, and it has a simplicity that complements and yet doesn't overpower the track. The song was originally designed to have an orchestral backing, but Tony ended up deciding to use a mellotron on it instead, and it's the last time that this instrument featured on a Genesis record. Around this time, the band said that they regretted some of the more comical tracks like Pigeons and Match of the Day being left off Win the Wuthering, so here, for better or worse, the Genesis quirky comedy number returns. Banks created the initial draft for the song but then abandoned it, and it was Phil Collins who picked up the pieces, rearranged it and gave it a more funky and upbeat feel, helped along by a great Rutherford bass line. Collins added new lyrics to the song about Little Nemo, a character from a fantastic Art Nouveau comic strip from the early 1900s, and leafing through this comic today we can practically see everything that Phil saw himself. It's as if he just randomly leafed through the comic book and found various images to write about.
Dragons breathing fire with friendly mushrooms tall as houses, giant nymphs and goblins playing scenes from a night's dream. Oh, Little Nemo, have young Washington in the garden, cut the cherry tree down. Now we all know that's not history, scenes from a night's dream. Oh, Little Nemo. Found themselves on a moving platform, 10-ton weights above them, seeking audience with King Morpheus, scenes from a night's dream. Oh, Little Nemo.
Special mention here must go to the weird science fiction track called The Day the Light Went Out, which in many ways is a kind of darker and more proggy variation on Scenes from a Night's Dream. It was used as the B-side to Many Too Many, and many fans regret that this wasn't included on the final album. Its omission could be because it suffers from the same problem as Get 'Em Out by Friday and Epping Forest, with million miles an hour lyrics that have been dismissed by Banks as being the worst he's ever written. Certainly Collins does have a hard time delivering them, especially the weird falsetto "Now I Can Rest Here" part.
Now I can rest here after my journey.
The Day the Light Went Out ranks as one of the strangest songs that this band ever did, and I suspect it's maybe a relic from the early Gabriel era. It's a shame that this song wasn't developed more by the band.
They tried in many fruitless ways to see the noonday sun by blasting with their missiles through the dark. But soon a kind of sleepy state came over everyone, till nothing seemed to stir or even breathe. And when the darkness chose to disappear, not many had survived. Then came my shadow, another had died. And again the light went out of the daytime
The album rolls on with the tender Rutherford ballad, Say It's Alright Joe. The song was designed to conjure up images of a wistful drunk propping up a late night bar at the Twilight Alehouse. By the time of Duke, Genesis had fully mastered the dynamic contrast between powerful rock numbers and tender, soulful ballads. I can believe what Collins is singing on that album, but here it just doesn't ring true to me. Say It's Alright Joe comes across sounding like two different songs, albeit good ones, simply bolted together, and perhaps it would have been more effective being left as a short ballad, something in the style of Duke's guide vocal perhaps.
I'm just a busy bee, still alive in my heart. I'm looking for some other world to dream out my dream.
Although Phil plays the song wonderfully on stage, maybe as time would sadly tell, there was more of Joe in him than he would care to admit at this point. This is another song written exclusively by Banks, and it bears all the hallmarks of his love for mythology and fantasy storytelling. The song has a wonderful structure, beginning with an organ-driven waltz, as we hear our protagonist tell a sword and sorcery tale of meeting a damsel in distress, or so it seems. So not to be outdone by the Lamia or the nymphs of Salmacis, our lying lady beckons our hero with an offer he can't refuse, with more than just wine and food on offer.
I'll give you wine and food too, and something special after if you like. So glad you could make it, we had everything arranged. So glad you saw fit to pay a call.
The villain of the piece is the man's own carnal lusts, which he just can't give into, and as the song fades away, it's like we can hear him being engulfed in a spiral of his own desires that he just can't resist. And it's here that we can hear the siren's call of "You Can't Resist Me." Once again, those Charterhouse Classics lessons really paid off. This is one of the most important and pivotal songs that this band ever made, and it's also one of their simplest. Writer Rutherford has frequently said how the song took him as much time to write as it takes us to listen to. He was dumbfounded at how quickly and easily the song came to him, and originally thought very little of it. In fact, at one point it wasn't even going to feature on the album at all. Although the fading end to The Lady Lies would have been a great way to conclude this album, there's no doubt that this track kind of feels like light at the end of a dark and wintry tunnel, although that tunnel does lead to great commercial fortunes ahead.
Follow you, will you follow me all the days and nights that we know will be? I will stay with you, will you stay with me? Just one single tear in each passing year.
Follow You, Follow Me gave the band their first top 10 hit, and it was successful in many other countries. The spongy guitar effect provides sunlight to melt away the album's heavy snow, and the funky, clinky percussion really gives the track a quirky edge. The song was originally called Calypso, with its rhythmic arrangement being inspired by the band's recent touring of Brazil. The track highlights the fact that it was Mike Rutherford, chief author of this, Turn It On Again, Mama, Invisible Touch and many others that arguably drove the band much more down the pop-orientated road than what Phil Collins is often blamed or credited for. Hypnosis designer Stone Ferguson has claimed that this cover is supposedly based on trails of light and the remains of things that used to be present, i.e. the former band members. However, I get the feeling that this explanation has been created retrospectively to give this cover some kind of justification. Hypnosis were using similar light trails and dramatic clouds on other covers around this time and were known to recycle lots of images, so therefore I get the feeling that this cover is just another throwaway idea that Hypnosis wanted to get rid of. Personally, I see the two main people as detectives who are examining things with torches and maybe a getaway car speeding off in the distance. The trailing lines and words written in light were inspired by the artist Pablo Picasso, who created similar light trail sketches. The album was released in March 1978 to mixed reviews, and the band themselves have frequently expressed a polite frustration with it, noting the lack of dynamic group material on it and an over-reliance on Banks' keyboards. Also the lack of quality guitar playing, something that Mike Rutherford freely and perhaps rightly admits. It's not that it's a bad album by any means, it's just that it's the first Genesis album not to significantly advance on the preceding one. To promote the album, a huge 100-day tour across North America, Canada and Europe, and for the first time Japan took place. It set a new benchmark in terms of lighting effects, with 6 huge computer-controlled plastic sheet mirrors rotating in time with the music. The use of colour and smoke and lasers and general drama was truly breathtaking.
Away from me, cold-blooded woman, your thirst is not mine.
The 78 shows contained arguably their most wide-ranging and fan-pleasing set to date. In addition to In the Cage and The Fountain of Salmacis being resurrected, fans heard the song Ripples played live for the first time. It's thought also that the Lamb's Grand Parade was also rehearsed for these shows but never actually played live. Weirdly enough, at one of the New York shows, an almost unrecognisable shaven-haired Gabriel turned up to join the band to join in with the track I Know What I Like. The tour culminated in Nebworth, playing to over 100,000 fans, and it was almost like every one of them was willing their band on to succeed. Playing on a midsummer's night, it was almost as if all concerned knew that the summer had peaked, and not before long a cold dark cloud would descend over their musical landscape. By this time Genesis was maybe all that they had left. And then there were three is a tricky one to review, and somewhere within it does lie a brilliant album, but I often find myself having to wade through what sounds like a murky metallic soup to find it. And again, it baffles me just why they spent a mere 2 weeks recording this album, and then for the tapes just to sit on a shelf for 6 months before they released them. You know, a remixing and a trimming and track alteration would improve this album significantly. Perhaps the kindest way to assess And Then There Were Three is that it's a sideways step rather than a step forward, as if the band were pausing and taking a deep breath before the path that lies ahead of them, namely the 1980s. For some fans, And Then There Were Three is the point at which the Genesis they know and love simply fades away into the cold night sky. But for others, however, it's the point at which they step out of the shadows of the 70s and truly begin to shine.